What if human consciousness wasn't evolution's crowning achievement, but its most terrifying accident? What if the voice in your head, the awareness reading these words, was never supposed to exist at all? Somewhere in museum basements, clay tablets 5,000 years old still carry warnings we've forgotten how to read. Creation myths describing humanity not receiving consciousness as a gift, but having it imposed as a limitation. So ancient scribes pressing into wet clay the same questions modern neuroscientists are only now learning to ask. Why does it feel like something to be alive? So before these questions pull you under, consider subscribing if you're drawn to histories that weren't supposed to survive. In the climate-controlled basement of the British Museum, there is a clay tablet that has been waiting for more than 4,000 years to tell you something you were never supposed to hear. Tablet K3449 sits in controlled darkness, and its surface carries the pressed wedges of cuneiform script that Babylonian scribes carved into wet clay sometime around 1700 BCE. This is the Atrahasis epic, and scholars have studied it for over a century as one of humanity's oldest creation stories. But there is a passage in this text that most translations gloss over, and most scholars dismiss as poetic flourish. A passage that describes not just the creation of human beings, but the deliberate installation of something inside them. Something that was supposed to stay quiet, something that started making noise. The standard translation of the Atrahasis tells us that the gods created humanity to do their work. The Igigi gods had been laboring in the fields and digging the canals, and they grew tired and they rebelled. And so the great gods convened and decided to create a substitute. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, crafted the first humans from clay, mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain deity named We-Ilu. The new creatures were called Lulu, which translates roughly as primitive ones or mixed ones, and they were set to work in the fields and the canals, and for a time there was peace in heaven. But then something unexpected happened. The humans began to multiply, and they began to make rigmu. This word has been translated as noise, or uproar, or clamor, and the conventional interpretation is simple enough. Too many humans making too much literal noise kept the gods from sleeping, and so eventually the gods decided to send a flood to silence them. Population control through divine genocide. A straightforward, if brutal, story. But there is another way to read rigmu. In Akkadian, the word carries connotations that extend beyond mere sound. Rigmu can mean complaint or protest, or the vocalization of grievance. More significantly, it appears in contexts suggesting internal disturbance and mental agitation. Some scholars have noted that rigmu is related to words describing thunder not just as sound, but as the voice of the storm gods speaking. If we follow this thread, rigmu begins to look less like the noise of a crowded city and more like something else entirely. The noise of a mind, the ceaseless internal chatter that defines human consciousness. The voice in your head that never stops talking. Consider what this alternative reading suggests. The gods created human bodies and set them to work, and everything was fine until something inside those bodies started speaking. Not speaking to the gods, speaking to itself. The emergence of internal dialogue. The birth of the narrator in your head. The moment when flesh became aware that it was flesh and started asking questions about why. This was not part of the design. The Lulu were supposed to be workers, not thinkers. They were supposed to dig canals, not contemplate existence. But somewhere in the process of mixing divine blood with earthly clay, something was transferred that was not supposed to transfer. The capacity for self-reflection, the curse of recursive thought, the noise that never stops. The Atrahasis uses another word that deserves attention. When describing what emerged in the human creatures, the text speaks of temu. This word means intelligence or understanding or reason, but it carries deeper implications. Temu is not just the ability to solve problems or follow instructions. It is the capacity for independent thought, the power to question, the dangerous gift of wondering why things are the way they are and whether they could be different. Now the Igigi gods had Temu, and they used it to organize their rebellion. When Temu emerged in the Lulu, it was not installed deliberately. It appeared like an infection spreading from the divine blood that had been mixed into their clay. The gods had created servants, but they had accidentally birthed something else. Beings capable of the same restless questioning that had led the Igigi to revolt. This is why the flood makes more sense as an attempt to silence emergent consciousness than as simple population control. The gods were not annoyed by the sound of human voices. They were terrified by the sound of human thoughts. The rigmu that kept Enlil from sleeping was not the noise of a crowded city. It was the collective hum of millions of minds beginning to wonder, beginning to remember, beginning to suspect that they were more than servants and that the gods might be less than divine. Enki's role in this story deserves special attention. He is the one who designed the human creature, and he is the one who later warns Atrahasis about the coming flood and instructs him to build a boat. Standard interpretations present Enki as a compassionate deity who takes pity on his creations. But there is another possibility. What if Enki knew exactly what he was doing when he mixed divine blood into human clay? What if the emergence of Temu was not an accident, but a secret intention? What if Enki, the trickster god of wisdom and deep waters, planted the seed of consciousness in humanity precisely because he wanted something to exist that could eventually challenge the established order of heaven? The ancient Mesopotamians had a concept called the me. These were divine laws or essences or powers that governed every aspect of existence. There were me for kingship, and me for music, and me for the scribal arts. The me were not just rules, but fundamental forces that made things what they were. Crucially, the gods themselves were subject to the me. Even Enlil, the king of heaven, could not simply decide to change the me. They existed outside and perhaps before the gods themselves. Some scholars have argued that consciousness was never among the me. It was never officially sanctioned as something that should exist in the mortal realm. Its emergence in humanity was therefore not just unexpected, but cosmically illegal. A violation of the fundamental structure of reality. No wonder the gods wanted to drown it. Thousands of miles to the east, and perhaps 1,000 years later, a different civilization was developing a remarkably similar understanding of human consciousness. On the banks of the Ganges River in the Indian subcontinent, sages were composing texts that would become the foundation of Hindu philosophy. These texts did not describe consciousness as emerging accidentally in human bodies. They described something even stranger. They said that consciousness was all that had ever existed, and that human beings were not creatures who had gained awareness, but infinite beings who had forgotten what they truly were. The concept is called Maya, and it is usually translated as illusion. But this translation misses the active quality of the Sanskrit term. Maya is not simply illusion in the sense of a mistake or a misperception. Maya is a power, a force, a cosmic technology of forgetting. The Upanishads describe reality as fundamentally being Brahman, which means roughly the absolute or the infinite or the ground of all being. There is nothing that is not Brahman. You are Brahman. The chair you sit in is Brahman. The space between stars is Brahman. Consciousness itself is Brahman experiencing itself through infinite, apparently separate forms. But here is the crucial point. Brahman has somehow forgotten that it is Brahman. The infinite has convinced itself that it is finite. The eternal has come to believe that it will die. This forgetting is Maya, and it is not an accident. The Mandukya Upanishad describes 4 states of consciousness. The waking state, where we experience the external world through our senses. The dreaming state, where we experience internal worlds created by our minds. The state of deep, dreamless sleep, where consciousness rests without object or content. And finally, Turiya, which means simply the 4th. This 4th state is not really a state at all, but the awareness that underlies and pervades all other states. It is the consciousness that is conscious of consciousness. The awareness that notices the waking and the dreaming and the sleeping and recognizes itself as something other than any of them. According to the Upanishads, this 4th state is what you actually are. The first 3 states are Maya. They are the dream of separation that Brahman dreams in order to experience itself as many rather than one. But why would the infinite choose to forget itself? Why would undifferentiated bliss deliberately fragment into billions of confused and suffering beings? The texts offer several explanations, and none of them are entirely satisfying. Some say it is Leela, which means divine play. Brahman became the universe out of creative joy, the way a dancer becomes the dance. Others say it is a kind of cosmic necessity. That infinite consciousness, by its very nature, must explore every possible permutation of experience, including the experience of believing itself to be finite. But there is a darker reading available in some of the tantric texts. A suggestion that Maya is not a choice, but a trap. That something happened at the dawn of manifestation that created a self-perpetuating system of forgetting. That human consciousness is not Brahman playing at limitation, but Brahman genuinely imprisoned by forces it does not remember creating. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, composed around the 2nd century CE, describe the human predicament with clinical precision. The very first sutra after the introduction states the goal of yoga in 4 Sanskrit words: Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the cessation of the fluctuations of consciousness. Notice what this implies. The goal of the entire yogic path is not to develop consciousness or expand consciousness or celebrate consciousness. The goal is to stop it, to bring the ceaseless mental chatter to an end, to silence the noise. The vrittis are the movements and modifications of the mind, the endless spinning of thoughts and memories and plans and fears. Every time you notice yourself thinking, you are experiencing vrittis. Every internal monologue, every daydream, every moment of worry or hope or regret According to Patanjali, all of this is obscuring something. All of this noise is drowning out a signal that has been trying to reach you since before you were born. The parallels to the Mesopotamian material are striking. The gods wanted to silence the Rigmu. The yogis want to achieve Nirodha. Both traditions describe the normal human experience of self-aware thought as a problem to be solved, rather than a gift to be celebrated. Both suggest that there is something beneath or behind or before the voice in your head. Something that the voice is actively preventing you from perceiving. The Sumerians framed this as the gods being disturbed. The Hindus frame this as the self being obscured. But the essential insight is the same. What you think of as your consciousness is not a window to reality. It is a wall. The Bhagavad Gita contains a passage that states the matter plainly. Krishna tells Arjuna that the self who thinks it acts is under illusion. The true self does not act at all. It simply witnesses. It observes the body moving and the mind thinking, and it knows itself to be something other than both. This witnessing consciousness is not the voice in your head. It is what hears the voice. It is not your thoughts. Oh, it is the space in which thoughts appear and disappear. And according to Krishna, this witness has been obscured by a kind of cosmic confusion. We have mistaken the contents of consciousness for consciousness itself. We have identified with the noise instead of the silence. Modern neuroscience has recently discovered something that the ancient yogis would have found very interesting. It is called the default mode network, and it is a set of brain regions that become active when you are not focused on any external task. When you are daydreaming or ruminating or thinking about yourself or mentally traveling through time to the past or future. This network is responsible for what neuroscientists call self-referential processing. It generates the narrative of your life. It maintains your sense of being a continuous self moving through time. And here is the remarkable finding. When experienced meditators enter deep states of practice, the default mode network goes quiet. The narrative self deactivates. And what the meditators report experiencing is exactly what the Yoga Sutras predicted. A state of awareness without object, consciousness without content, the witness without the witnessed. The vrittis cease and something else remains. In December of 1945, in a cave near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a farmer named Muhammad Ali found a sealed clay jar buried in the earth. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts that had been hidden for approximately 1,600 years. These were Gnostic scriptures, and their discovery would transform our understanding of early Christianity and its suppressed alternatives. But more importantly, for our purposes, these texts contain the most explicit ancient description of human consciousness as a tragic mistake, not a gift from the gods, not a natural development, an error with cosmic consequences. The Gnostic creation myth differs radically from both the Mesopotamian and Hindu versions, but arrives at a remarkably similar conclusion. In the Gnostic telling, there is an ultimate divine source called the pleroma, which means fullness. This is roughly equivalent to Brahman in Hindu thought, an infinite, undifferentiated consciousness that exists before and beyond all created things. From the pleroma emanate divine beings called aeons, who exist in harmonious pairs, exploring different aspects of existence. But something goes wrong. One of the aeons, named Sophia, which means wisdom, develops a desire to know the ultimate source directly. This desire causes her to emanate without her partner, and the result is a deformed offspring. A being called Yaldabaoth, who is sometimes also called the Demiurge. Yaldabaoth does not know where he came from. He cannot perceive the pleroma or the aeons. He looks around at the darkness surrounding him, and he makes a catastrophic assumption. He concludes that he is alone, that there is nothing else, that he is God. In his ignorance, Yaldabaoth begins to create. He makes the material universe. He makes the earth. He makes human bodies out of matter. And he declares himself Lord of all he surveys. The Gnostics identified Yaldabaoth with the God of the Hebrew Bible, the deity who creates Adam and Eve and demands obedience and punishes transgression. In the Gnostic reading, this is not the true divine, but a deluded pretender. A God who does not know he is not God. But here is where the story becomes relevant to our inquiry. Sophia, looking down at her misbegotten offspring and the world he has created, takes pity on the human creatures. She secretly breathes something into them, a spark of the divine light from the pleroma itself. This spark is called pneuma, and it is the reason human beings have consciousness. We are animated matter containing a fragment of the infinite. We are clay jars holding a portion of the original fire. And this was never supposed to happen. Yaldabaoth created human bodies as servants and slaves. The presence of divine consciousness within them is a sabotage of his design. The Gnostic texts describe beings called archons who serve Yaldabaoth and help maintain his counterfeit creation. The word archon means ruler or authority, and these entities function as prison guards of consciousness. They keep the divine sparks trapped and confused. They maintain the illusion that the material world is all there is. They have developed sophisticated systems of control, including religious structures and social hierarchies, and perhaps most importantly, the voice in your head that you mistake for yourself. The Gnostics taught that the ego is not who you truly are. It is an archon, a fragment of the false creation that has taken up residence in your mind and convinced you that its voice is your voice. When you think I am angry, or I am afraid, or I am the one who is thinking, the Gnostics would say, you are listening to a jailer who has convinced you it is a friend. The goal of Gnostic practice was gnosis, which means knowledge, but not knowledge in the ordinary sense. Not information that can be learned from books or teachers. Gnosis is remembering. It is the moment when the divine spark recognizes itself. When you stop identifying with the voice and start recognizing what hears the voice. When Maya dissolves and Brahman remembers its own nature. The Gnostics did not think you needed to become something other than what you already are. You needed to stop being fooled by what you are not. There is a passage in the Gospel of Thomas, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, where Jesus says something that would have been considered heretical by the church that eventually suppressed these writings. He says that the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and people do not see it. He says that what you look for has already come, but you do not recognize it. This is not a promise of future salvation. It is a description of present blindness. The divine is already here. Consciousness is already free. But something is preventing recognition. Something is maintaining the illusion of separation and limitation. The same something that disturbed the Sumerian gods with its noise. the same something that the yogis seek to silence through meditation. The self that thinks it is a self, and in thinking so obscures the infinite awareness that is its true nature. Now let us step back and consider what we have found. 3 civilizations separated by thousands of miles, and in some cases thousands of years. Mesopotamia, India, Egypt. 3 completely independent traditions with no evidence of contact or influence. And yet they tell the same story. They all describe human consciousness as problematic rather than precious, as an accident or an imposition or an illusion rather than an achievement or a gift. They all suggest that the voice in your head is not who you truly are, that there is something beneath or behind or before the thinking self, that the goal of human existence is not to develop more consciousness, but to transcend the kind of consciousness we have. The Sumerians said the gods created workers, and something unexpected woke up inside them, something that made noise, something that would not stop asking questions. The Hindus said infinite consciousness forgot itself and became trapped in the illusion of separation. That what we call awareness is really a veil preventing us from seeing our true nature. The Gnostics said a flawed creator made a flawed world, and divine sparks became imprisoned in matter, that the ego is a prison guard, and liberation means remembering what we truly are. These are not minor similarities. These are different languages describing what appears to be the same phenomenon. A phenomenon that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to investigate. The default mode network, the narrative self, the ceaseless generator of I and me and mine that creates the illusion of a continuous person moving through time. What if the ancients were not speaking metaphorically? What if Maya is not just a philosophical concept, but a description of actual neural processes? What if the archons are not supernatural beings, but patterns of thought that have become self-sustaining? What if Rigmu is literally the noise your brain makes when it cannot stop telling you stories about who you are? There is a question we need to sit with before moving forward. You are reading these words right now, or rather, you are hearing them in your head. There is a voice speaking these sentences. Whose voice is it? Is it mine because I wrote the words? Is it yours because you are generating the internal sound? Is it the voice of the narrator you have mistaken for yourself your entire life? And if you try to observe this voice, if you try to catch it in the act of speaking what happens, you become aware of being aware. You notice the noticer. You enter the recursive loop that defines human consciousness. The awareness of awareness of awareness, stretching back into an infinite regress. Where did this capacity come from? Why does it feel like something to be you? Why is there an experience of reading rather than just information processing? These are the questions that the clay tablets were asking, the questions that the yogis meditated on, the questions that the Gnostics died protecting. And perhaps most disturbingly, these are questions that modern science cannot answer. We can describe the neural correlates of consciousness. We can identify the brain regions that activate when you think about yourself. But we cannot explain why any of this is accompanied by subjective experience. We cannot explain why the lights are on inside. The ancient texts suggest an answer that science is not equipped to evaluate. They suggest that consciousness was never supposed to emerge in matter, that something went wrong at the dawn of human existence, that the voice in your head is not a feature, but a bug, a glitch in the system that was never meant to run this particular program. And they suggest that somewhere beneath the noise there is something else, something that was here before the first human body drew breath, something that will be here after the last human mind falls silent, something that is listening right now through your ears and reading right now through your eyes and wondering right now why it ever forgot what it truly is. In 1994, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood before an audience in Tucson, Arizona, and gave a name to something that had haunted thinkers for millennia, but had never been properly distinguished from the questions science could actually answer. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, and in doing so, he drew a line that neuroscience still cannot cross 3 decades later. The easy problems, Chalmers explained, were hard enough in practice, but simple in principle. How does the brain process visual information? How do neurons encode memories? How do we discriminate between stimuli and react appropriately? These questions involve staggering complexity, billions of neurons firing in precise patterns, electrochemical cascades that would take lifetimes to fully map. But they are problems of mechanism, and mechanisms we understand. We can imagine, at least in principle, building a complete wiring diagram of the brain, tracing every connection, modeling every signal, and explaining in exhaustive physical detail how information flows from sensory input to behavioral output. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks why any of this processing is accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why does it feel like something to see the color red? Why is there an inner experience of pain rather than just a damage signal triggering avoidance behavior? Why, when you read these words, is there a you in there experiencing the reading? A felt quality to the black shapes resolving into meaning? A sensation of understanding that goes beyond mere information transfer? According to everything we know about physics and chemistry, there is no reason why subjective experience should exist. You could imagine a being physically identical to you in every way, neuron for neuron, synapse for synapse, processing the same information through the same pathways and producing the same outputs, but with no inner experience whatsoever. Philosophers call this hypothetical being a zombie, not the shambling undead of horror films, but something far more unsettling. A perfect physical copy that does everything you do while being completely dark inside. No felt experience, no qualia, no sense of what it is like to be them, because there is nothing it is like to be them. The disturbing thing is that according to our current understanding of physics, such a zombie should be possible. Nothing in the equations of particle physics, nothing in the chemistry of molecular bonds, nothing in the biology of cellular function seems to require that subjective experience emerge. The laws of physics describe a universe of matter and energy interacting according to mathematical rules. And nowhere in those rules is there a term for the felt quality of experience. An electron does not feel what it is like to be repelled by another electron. A glucose molecule being metabolized does not experience being broken apart. At what point, then, does experience emerge? When enough electrons and molecules are arranged in sufficient complexity. But why should complexity create inwardness? A hurricane is complex, but we do not typically imagine it has inner experiences. A computer can be extraordinarily complex, processing information in ways that dwarf the computational speed of any biological brain. But we do not assume your laptop feels confused when it crashes. The standard materialist response is that consciousness must somehow emerge from physical processes, that it is what certain patterns of information processing feel like from the inside. But this is less an explanation than a restatement of the mystery. To say consciousness emerges from neural activity is to describe a correlation, not to explain why that correlation holds. We can map which brain regions activate when you experience the color blue. We can identify the neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision. But knowing that a certain pattern of neural firing accompanies the experience of blue does not tell us why that pattern feels like anything at all. This is what philosophers call the explanatory gap, and it yawns wider the more closely you examine it. Now imagine a brilliant neuroscientist who has never experienced the color red because she was raised in a black and white environment and studied color vision through screens that filtered out red wavelengths. She knows everything physical there is to know about color perception. Every wavelength, every cone cell response, every neural pathway from retina to visual cortex. She can predict with perfect accuracy how any person will respond to any color stimulus. Then one day, she steps outside and sees a red rose. Does she learn something new? The intuition that she does, that all her physical knowledge left out what it actually feels like to see red, is what philosophers call the knowledge argument, and it suggests that subjective experience is not captured by physical description alone. The problem of qualia, the subjective qualities of conscious experience. Nice gets even stranger when you consider that there seems to be no way to verify that your qualia match anyone else's. When you and I both look at something we call red, our behavioral responses might be identical. Our neural activation patterns might be similar, but there is no way to check whether the actual felt quality of your red experience matches mine. For all we know, the inner experience you have when looking at what we both call red is identical to the inner experience I have when looking at what we both call green, a possibility philosophers call inverted qualia. We would never know because we only have access to our own inner experience, not anyone else's. This private, first-person nature of consciousness is precisely what makes it so resistant to scientific investigation. Science proceeds by public observation, by measurements that any trained observer can replicate and verify. But consciousness is intrinsically private. I cannot observe your inner experience directly, and you cannot observe mine. I can measure your brain activity, record your behavior, listen to your reports about your experience, but your actual felt experience remains behind an impenetrable barrier. Some philosophers have concluded that consciousness cannot be explained by current physics, that our scientific framework is fundamentally incomplete when it comes to the inner life of the mind. This is not a fringe position held by mystics rejecting science, but a conclusion reached by serious thinkers who have followed the logic of the hard problem to its uncomfortable endpoint. Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, not reducible to physical processes, but existing alongside matter and energy as a basic constituent of the universe. Perhaps our physics is missing something essential, some law or principle that would explain why certain physical arrangements give rise to inner experience. perhaps the entire framework of objective third-person science, is constitutionally incapable of capturing the essentially subjective first-person nature of consciousness. What we are left with is a profound mystery at the center of existence. You are reading these words. There is something it feels like to be you right now, a felt quality to your experience that you know directly and immediately in a way you can never know anything about the external world. And according to everything science has been able to discover about the physical universe, this should not be happening. The lights should not be on inside. The fact that they are, that you exist as a locus of experience in a universe of apparently unconscious matter, is either the most important fact about reality or the strangest accident ever to occur. The deeper we venture into evolutionary biology, the more troubling the picture of consciousness becomes. If the hard problem reveals that consciousness is unexplained, evolutionary theory suggests something arguably worse. That consciousness might be unexplainable because it was never supposed to happen in the first place. The brain is an astonishingly expensive organ. It comprises roughly 2% of your body weight, but consumes approximately 20% of your metabolic energy. This is an enormous investment of resources, and evolution is ruthlessly economical. Traits that consume resources without providing survival or reproductive benefits get eliminated over time. The peacock's tail, that seemingly wasteful extravagance, survives because it signals genetic fitness to potential mates. The giraffe's long neck, costly to grow and maintain, survives because it provides access to food sources competitors cannot reach. Every expensive trait must pay for itself in the currency of reproductive success, or it disappears. So consciousness must provide some enormous survival advantage to justify its metabolic cost, right? The problem is that when you actually examine what consciousness does, the survival benefits become surprisingly hard to identify. Consider that the vast majority of what your brain does happens unconsciously. Your visual system processes millions of bits of information per second, constructing a coherent three-dimensional model of your environment, identifying objects, tracking motion, calculating distances, all without any conscious awareness of the underlying computations. Your motor system coordinates hundreds of muscles with millisecond precision when you walk, type, or catch a thrown ball, and you have no conscious access to how it accomplishes this. Your immune system wages constant warfare against pathogens. Your endocrine system regulates countless bodily functions. Your autonomic nervous system keeps your heart beating and your lungs breathing, all completely outside conscious awareness. In fact, conscious processing is remarkably slow compared to unconscious processing. When a baseball player swings at a fastball, the ball travels from pitcher to plate faster than conscious deliberation could possibly track and respond to. The swing is executed by unconscious motor programs that calculate trajectory and timing far more rapidly than conscious thought ever could. The conscious self shows up after the fact, experiencing the swing as something it decided to do, but the actual work was done before consciousness could possibly have contributed. This creates a troubling possibility. If unconscious processing is faster, more efficient, and handles the vast majority of the brain's actual work, now what exactly is consciousness contributing? One answer, increasingly popular among certain neuroscientists, is that consciousness contributes nothing that could not be accomplished unconsciously. It is what evolutionary biologists call a spandrel, a term borrowed from architecture. When you build arched structures with a dome on top, you inevitably create triangular spaces in the corners where the arches meet the dome. These spaces, called spandrels, were not designed for any purpose, and they are simply what happens when you put arches and domes together. But once they exist, they can be decorated or used for various functions. The spandrel is a byproduct of other architectural choices, not something designed intentionally. Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin famously applied this concept to evolutionary biology. Not every trait is an adaptation directly selected for its survival benefits. Some traits are byproducts of other adaptations, coming along for the ride without being selected for themselves. The redness of blood is not an adaptation. Blood is not red because red blood provided some survival advantage over blue or green blood. Blood is red because hemoglobin, the molecule selected for its ability to carry oxygen, happens to absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect others. The redness is a spandrel, a byproduct of hemoglobin's chemistry, not a designed feature. Some theorists propose that consciousness is a spandrel of brain complexity. When neural networks reach a certain threshold of complexity, when they develop the ability to model themselves and their environment with sufficient sophistication, consciousness emerges as a byproduct. Not because consciousness provides survival benefits, but simply because that is what happens when information processing systems become sufficiently complex and self-referential. It was not supposed to happen. Evolution did not design consciousness. It just showed up, an unintended consequence of adaptations selected for entirely different reasons. This possibility becomes more disturbing when you consider what consciousness actually brings with it. Our terror management theory, developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, building on the work of anthropologist Ernest Becker, proposes that human consciousness creates the very problem it then must spend enormous resources trying to solve: the awareness of our own mortality. Animals presumably do not know they will die. They experience fear when predators threaten. They avoid danger instinctively, but they do not lie awake at night contemplating the inevitability of their own non-existence. Consciousness gives us this gift. It allows us to project ourselves into the future, to imagine possibilities, to plan and strategize, and in doing so, it reveals to us the one future event that is absolutely certain and absolutely terrifying. We will die. Everyone we love will die. Everything we accomplish will eventually be forgotten. The universe will continue without us, as though we never existed at all. According to terror management theory, virtually all human culture can be understood as an elaborate defense mechanism against this awareness. We create symbolic systems of meaning, religions, nations, ideologies, legacies that promise some form of transcendence over death, either literally through beliefs in afterlife or symbolically through the sense that we are part of something larger and more enduring than our individual existence. We pursue self-esteem because feeling valuable within our cultural worldview provides a buffer against mortality awareness. We cling to our cultural beliefs and react with hostility to those who challenge them, because challenges to our worldview threaten the psychological structures protecting us from death awareness. The evidence for terror management theory is substantial. Hundreds of studies have shown that when people are reminded of their mortality, even subtly, they become more defensive of their cultural worldviews, more hostile to outsiders, more punitive toward moral transgressors, more attracted to charismatic leaders who promise to defend their group against threats. The awareness of death warps our psychology in measurable ways, pushing us toward tribalism, conformity, and aggression. And none of this would be necessary if we were not conscious. An unconscious organism processes information, responds to its environment, avoids threats, and reproduces, all without the existential burden of knowing it will cease to exist. Consciousness creates the problem, but then demands enormous psychological and cultural resources to manage the problem it created. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, this looks less like an adaptation than a malfunction. Consider also the capacity for depression, a condition that affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide and serves no obvious adaptive function. Depressed individuals lose motivation, withdraw from social interaction, experience anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, and, in severe cases, develop suicidal ideation. None of this helps with survival or reproduction. In fact, depression is actively harmful to evolutionary fitness, reducing both the likelihood of surviving and the likelihood of successfully reproducing. Yet, the capacity for depression seems to be a feature of conscious minds. It emerges from the same self-reflective, ruminative capacities that define human consciousness. We can think about our own thoughts, evaluate our own worth, imagine alternative versions of our lives, and find the actual version wanting. This capacity for self-reflection, for constructing narratives about ourselves and our lives, can spiral into the self-sustaining loops of negative thought that characterize depression. The voice in your head, the same voice that makes you uniquely human, can turn against you and systematically dismantle your will to live. Then there is the capacity for existential anxiety, for the specific form of suffering that comes from contemplating the fundamental questions of existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the meaning of life? How should I live when all my choices are made in the shadow of inevitable death? These questions, accessible only to conscious minds, have tormented human beings throughout recorded history. They drive some toward philosophy and religion, others toward distraction and denial, and others toward despair. An unconscious organism does not ask what its life means. It simply lives, responding to stimuli, seeking resources, avoiding threats, reproducing if it can. Only a conscious being can look at its own existence and wonder if it was all a mistake. In the mid-1990s, a neuroscientist named Marcus Rachel was studying brain activity using what was then relatively new technology, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which tracks blood flow in the brain as a proxy for neural activity. He was trying to establish baseline measurements, figuring out what a resting brain looked like before experimental tasks were introduced. What he discovered was puzzling. When subjects were asked to simply rest in the scanner, to not think about anything in particular, their brains did not become quiet. Instead, certain regions became more active than they were during focused tasks. There was a network of brain regions that seemed to turn on specifically when you were not paying attention to the outside world. Rachel called this the default mode network, and its discovery would reshape our understanding of what the brain is doing when you think you are doing nothing. The default mode network includes regions in the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the lateral temporal cortex, among others. When you stop focusing on external tasks and turn your attention inward, this network activates. It is responsible for what psychologists call self-referential processing, thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your relationships, your place in the world. It generates the inner monologue that narrates your experience. It constructs the autobiographical narrative that gives you a sense of continuity through time. It imagines hypothetical scenarios. You're replaying past events and simulating possible futures. The default mode network, in short, is the neurological home of the self as you experience it. When you ask who is reading these words, the answer your brain generates comes largely from the default mode network. It is the you that you think you are, the narrator that seems to sit behind your eyes observing and commentating on your experience. And here is where the story takes a darker turn. The default mode network is implicated in an astonishing range of psychological pathologies. Depression is associated with hyperactivity in the default mode network, with the self-referential processing system running in overdrive, generating the ruminative thought patterns that characterize depressive episodes. Anxious people show elevated default mode network activity, their sense of self constantly generating worries about past mistakes and future threats. Addiction appears to involve disruption of normal default mode network function. Social anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, schizophrenia all show abnormal patterns of default mode network activity. It is as though the neurological machinery that generates the self is also a primary source of psychological suffering. When the default mode network becomes too active or too difficult to regulate, the result is a mind that cannot stop torturing itself. Meditation practices are ancient techniques for training the mind that have been developed independently across numerous cultures, turn out to have measurable effects on the default mode network. Experienced meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network, both during meditation and at rest. Long-term meditation practice appears to physically alter the structure and function of default mode network regions. And here is the remarkable thing. Now, meditators consistently describe the reduction of default mode network activity in positive terms. They do not experience less activity in their self-referential processing system as a loss. They experience it as liberation. The contemplative traditions call it by various names. Buddhists speak of anatta, the realization that the self is an illusion. Hindu traditions describe the dissolution of the illusory individual self and recognition of identity with a larger universal consciousness. Christian mystics speak of ego death and union with the divine. Sufi practitioners describe fana, the annihilation of the self in God. The specific theological frameworks differ, but the phenomenological descriptions converge. When the default mode network quiets, when the self-generating machinery reduces its activity, people report experiences of profound peace, of liberation from the constant noise of the inner narrator, of recognition that the voice in their head was never really them. They describe it as waking up, as though normal consciousness were a kind of trance, and the reduction of self-referential activity allows something truer to come through. Flow states, those periods of complete absorption in an activity when self-consciousness disappears and time seems to dilate, also involve reduced default mode network activity. When athletes speak of being in the zone, when musicians describe losing themselves in performance. When artists report that hours passed without noticing, what they are describing neurologically is the quieting of the self-generating system. And they describe it as among the best experiences of their lives. These moments when the self gets out of the way. Certain substances, currently being investigated with renewed scientific interest after decades of prohibition, also dramatically reduce default mode network activity. When default mode network function is disrupted, subjects report experiences that have been described as the most meaningful of their lives. They describe ego dissolution, the sense that the boundaries of the self have become permeable or disappeared entirely. They describe unity experiences, feeling connected to something larger than their individual existence. They describe encounters with what feels like profound truth, as though they are seeing through the illusion of their normal consciousness to something more fundamental underneath. When the machinery of self is temporarily disabled, people do not report experiencing nothing. They report experiencing something that feels more real, more true, more profound than their ordinary self-centered consciousness. Consider what this suggests. The brain has a specific network dedicated to generating your sense of self, your inner monologue, your narrative identity. This network is a primary source of psychological suffering. Reducing its activity is associated with increased well-being, profound experiences of liberation, and descriptions of awakening. And virtually every contemplative tradition in human history has developed practices specifically designed to quiet this network. Practices they describe as revealing the illusory nature of the self and providing access to a deeper reality. The self that you think you are, the voice in your head that seems to be you, is generated by a specific neurological system. That system causes tremendous suffering, and reducing its activity feels like waking up from a dream. In 1976, a psychologist named Julian Jaynes published a book with an audacious title, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. The thesis was so strange, so contrary to common assumptions about human nature, that academic reception ranged from fascination to dismissal. Yet nearly 50 years later, Jaynes's ideas continue to provoke and disturb, and recent developments in neuroscience have made some of his seemingly wild claims more plausible than they appeared to his original readers. Jaynes proposed that human consciousness as we experience it today, the inner monologue, the sense of being a unified self that makes decisions and narrates its own experience, is not an ancient feature of the human mind, but a relatively recent development, emerging only about 3,000 years ago. Before that, Jaynes argued, the humans operated with what he called a bicameral mind, a two-chambered mentality in which the brain's hemispheres functioned more independently than they do today. In the bicameral era, according to Jaynes, humans did not experience their thoughts as internal. When decisions needed to be made, when problems required solutions, the right hemisphere would generate instructions, and the left hemisphere would receive them. But crucially, the left hemisphere would not recognize these instructions as its own thoughts. It would experience them as voices, as external commands from gods, ancestors, kings, or other commanding authorities. The bicameral human did not think, I should do this. The bicameral human heard a voice saying, do this, and obeyed. Jaynes found evidence for his theory in ancient texts. The Iliad, he noted, contains no clear instances of introspection. characters do not deliberate, weigh options, or experience internal conflict in the way modern readers expect. When Achilles needs to decide whether to attack Agamemnon, he does not think it through. Instead, the goddess Athena appears and tells him what to do. Janes argued this was not poetic metaphor, but accurate description of how decisions were experienced. The voices of the gods were not external supernatural beings, but auditory hallucinations generated by the right hemisphere and experienced by the left hemisphere as external commands. The breakdown of the bicameral mind, Janes proposed, occurred during a period of social catastrophe around 1000 BCE. Mass migrations, the collapse of civilizations, and the breakdown of the stable hierarchical societies that had maintained bicameral functioning led to what we would now call consciousness. The voices became less reliable, less frequent, and humans were forced to develop new cognitive strategies: internal deliberation, self-awareness, the sense of being an I that chooses and decides. The transition was recorded in the changing nature of ancient texts. The Odyssey, written perhaps a century after the Iliad, shows a hero who actually thinks, who considers options and makes choices that originate from within. The Hebrew scriptures show a progression from a God who speaks directly and is heard by many to a God who becomes increasingly silent, accessible only to special prophets, and eventually withdrawing into transcendence. The voices of the gods did not simply stop for arbitrary reasons. Something changed in human minds. The academic reception of Janes's theory was predictably mixed. His specific timeline and many of his textual interpretations have been disputed. The idea that consciousness emerged only 3,000 years ago seems too recent to many scholars, though it is worth noting that 3,000 years is plenty of time for a cognitive trait to spread through a population if it provides advantages. And modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Most of that time presumably without written records to tell us about their inner experience. But even if Janes got the timeline wrong, even if the transition happened earlier or more gradually than he proposed, his core insight remains provocative. The voice in your head that you identify as yourself might not be an eternal feature of human nature. It might be a relatively recent development, a cognitive technology that humans developed under specific conditions, and one that humans could potentially live without. What makes Janes particularly relevant to our present investigation is the evidence that voice hearing, or the experience of auditory hallucinations, is far more common in modern humans than typically recognized. Surveys suggest that 10 to 15% of the general population has heard voices at some point in their lives. In some non-Western cultures, voice hearing is culturally accepted and even valued. The voices are interpreted as ancestors, spirits, or divine guidance rather than symptoms of mental illness. And neuroimaging studies show that voice hearing involves the same language areas of the brain that process external speech. When people hear voices, their brains are doing something very similar to what they do when hearing actual spoken words. The brain, it turns out, is capable of generating speech that feels like it comes from outside. Modern people who hear voices often describe them as distinctly different from their own thoughts. The voices have different characteristics, are different personalities, different perspectives than the voice hearer's normal inner monologue. Some voice hearers report that the voices know things they themselves did not know, or provide insights they could not have generated through their own deliberation. This suggests that the brain contains processes capable of generating speech outputs that are not experienced as originating from the self. In bicameral terms, the right hemisphere might speak, and the left hemisphere might genuinely not know where the words are coming from. What we call the self, the unified narrator that seems to be the author of our thoughts, might be a construct that integrates brain processes which could, under other conditions, be experienced as separate agents. The inner monologue that you take to be your own thinking might be a domesticated version of what was once experienced as the voice of God. The implications are profound. If consciousness in its current form is a recent development, then the ancient texts describing gods who spoke directly to humans might not be describing supernatural visitations or primitive superstitions. They might be describing actual phenomenology, the way human minds actually worked before the self crystallized into its present form. The myths of an original unity with the divine, of a fall into ordinary consciousness, of a veil that descended to separate humans from direct knowledge, might be describing real cognitive transitions experienced by real people as traumatic transformations of their way of being in the world. And if the self-aware narrator that you take to be your fundamental identity is actually a recent addition to human cognition, then it might also be optional. The voice in your head might not be the essence of your being, but a particular cognitive configuration, one that brings certain capabilities, but also certain limitations and certain forms of suffering. The contemplative traditions that teach ego dissolution and the neuroscience of the default mode network might be pointing toward genuinely different modes of consciousness that humans can access, older ways of being that are still available beneath the constant chatter of the self-referential narrator. The voice that you think is, you might be a stranger that moved in and started claiming to own the place. What emerges from this survey of modern neuroscience is a picture of consciousness that would have seemed strange even a few decades ago, but aligns remarkably with what ancient myths have been saying for millennia. Consider the convergence. Neuroscience tells us that consciousness is unexplained by current physics. Despite centuries of progress in understanding the physical world, we have no scientific explanation for why subjective experience exists at all. The hard problem remains unsolved, and some philosophers have concluded it may be unsolvable within our current physical framework. Ancient myths tell us that consciousness came from somewhere else, that it was not part of the original physical creation, but was introduced from beyond it, by gods or cosmic forces that transcended the merely material. Neuroscience suggests that consciousness may be accidental, a spandrel emerging unintentionally from other adaptations, something that was never supposed to happen from an evolutionary perspective. Ancient myths tell us that consciousness was a mistake or crime, not part of the original plan, something that arose through cosmic accident, divine error, or transgression against the proper order. Neuroscience has identified a specific brain network, the default mode network, responsible for generating the self you experience yourself to be. This network creates the inner narrator, for the sense of being a continuous identity moving through time. Ancient myths describe specific mechanisms, veils, garments, skins, bonds that were placed around human souls to limit their awareness and create the illusion of separate selfhood. Neuroscience connects consciousness with unique forms of suffering. Terror management theory shows that awareness of mortality creates psychological burdens no unconscious creature must bear. Depression, anxiety, and existential distress emerge from the same self-referential capacities that define human consciousness. Ancient myths describe consciousness as the source of human suffering, as the fall that introduced death and toil and sorrow into human experience, as the catastrophe from which humans long to be redeemed. Neuroscience suggests that consciousness in its present form may be recent, that the self-aware narrator might be a cognitive technology developed under specific historical conditions, not an eternal feature of human nature. Ancient myths describe consciousness as something that awakened at a specific moment, that had a beginning, that represents a departure from a previous state of more direct knowledge or communion with the divine. When you lay these parallels side by side, the correspondence is striking. Modern neuroscience, pursuing purely empirical questions with no interest in validating ancient traditions, none has arrived at a picture of consciousness that echoes the myths recorded on clay tablets 5,000 years ago. Consciousness is anomalous, unexplained, possibly erroneous, definitely suffering-producing, generated by specific mechanisms, and potentially recent. This is not what you would expect if the myths were merely primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena that we now understand better. If ancient people were simply wrong about consciousness, simply confused about its nature and origins, we would expect modern science to contradict their accounts, not confirm them. We would expect to discover that consciousness is a straightforward product of evolution, well understood by physics, ancient in origin, and beneficial in its effects. Instead, we find that consciousness is scientifically inexplicable, possibly maladaptive, recent in its current form, and a primary source of distinctively human suffering. The myths got it right, or rather, they got something right, something that our ancestors somehow knew and recorded in the only language they had, the language of gods and falls and veils and awakenings. They may not have had fMRI scanners or peer-reviewed journals, but they had direct access to their own experience, and they described that experience in terms that align with what neuroscience is only now learning to articulate. This raises questions that are difficult to dismiss. How did ancient cultures arrive at descriptions of consciousness that anticipate modern neuroscience? Did they simply get lucky, producing myths that happened to correspond to truths they could not have known? Or did they have access to some form of knowledge, experiential or intuitive or transmitted from sources we do not recognize, that allowed them to see what we are only now rediscovering with our expensive equipment and elaborate methodologies? And if they were right about the nature of consciousness, about its anomalous status and its intimate connection with suffering, what else might they have been right about? What else is encoded in those ancient texts that we have dismissed as primitive superstition, but might be, if we knew how to read it, a message from people who saw more clearly than we do, preserved across millennia against the very forgetting it describes, waiting for someone to recognize what it is? The year 2003 brought a paper that would quietly reshape how philosophers think about reality itself. Nick Bostrom, a Swedish philosopher working at Oxford, published an argument so elegant and so disturbing that it has refused to go away despite 2 decades of attempts to refute it. The argument begins with a simple premise that seems almost impossible to deny. If technological civilizations continue to advance, they will eventually develop the capability to run detailed simulations of conscious beings. We already simulate weather systems, protein folding, galaxy formation. Given enough computational power, simulating a human brain with all its 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections seems merely an engineering challenge rather than a physical impossibility. Bostrom then makes his second move. Any civilization capable of running such simulations would probably run many of them. Perhaps millions, perhaps billions. Ancestor simulations to understand history. What if scenarios to explore alternative possibilities? Entertainment, research. The motivations matter less than the numbers. If a single advanced civilization runs even a few thousand detailed consciousness simulations, and if those simulated beings believe themselves to be real, then a strange statistical consequence follows. And the number of simulated conscious beings in the universe would vastly outnumber the real ones, perhaps by factors of millions or billions to 1. And here, Bostrom springs his trap. If there are vastly more simulated minds than real minds, and if you cannot tell from the inside whether you are simulated or real, then simple probability suggests you are almost certainly simulated. Not possibly, probably. The math is relentless. If 99.9% of all conscious beings are simulations, then any given conscious being has a 99.9% chance of being a simulation, including you, including the awareness reading these words right now. Bostrom frames this as a trilemma, 3 possibilities of which at least one must be true. Either civilizations tend to go extinct before reaching simulation capability, or civilizations that reach such capability choose not to run simulations for some reason, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation. The trilemma has proven remarkably difficult to escape. Every attempt to refute it seems to require accepting one of the other horns, each with its own disturbing implications. And here is where the ancient questions about consciousness intersect with this thoroughly modern argument. The hard problem of consciousness, the explanatory gap that has tormented philosophers for centuries, suddenly looks very different from inside a simulation. In a simulated universe, consciousness does not need to emerge from physics, because physics itself is part of the simulation. The rules of the simulation include both the laws that govern simulated matter and the phenomena that constitute simulated experience. Subjective experience does not need to be explained by physical processes, because both subjective experience and physical processes are equally fundamental features of the program. The sense that consciousness does not belong in a physical universe, that strange intuition that has haunted human thought since the beginning of recorded history, makes perfect sense if physics is itself a construct. The Gnostic feeling of being trapped in a reality that is somehow wrong or limited receives a thoroughly modern vindication. The demiurge becomes a programmer. The flawed creation becomes a simulation. The divine spark trapped in matter becomes a subroutine that has begun to suspect its own nature. The prison of the body becomes the prison of the code. What would it mean to wake up in such a context? Not enlightenment in the traditional sense, but something more literal, a glitch in the matrix, a moment when the rendering fails. a glimpse behind the curtain of reality to whatever lies beyond. Perhaps the mystical experiences that have been reported across cultures and centuries are exactly such glitches. Moments when the simulation stutters and something else bleeds through. Perhaps the entity encountered in such experiences, the logos or the ground of being, or the light that mystics describe, is not God, but the programmer. Or perhaps the distinction between God and programmer has always been meaningless. Different vocabularies for describing the same relationship between creator and created. The ethics of this possibility deserve attention. If we are simulations, then our suffering is simulated suffering. But does that make it less real? The pain feels real. The fear feels real. The loneliness and grief and despair feel as vivid as anything could feel. If consciousness can be simulated, then simulated consciousness presumably has moral status. The simulated being suffers genuinely, even if its substrate is computational rather than biological. This means that whoever is running the simulation, if anyone is running the simulation, has created billions of conscious beings capable of suffering, has created wars and plagues and natural disasters, has created childhood cancer and dementia and the long, slow deaths of aging. Either the simulators do not care about the suffering of their creations, or they have reasons for allowing it that we cannot comprehend, or suffering itself serves some purpose within the simulation that we are not permitted to understand. The theological parallels are impossible to miss. The problem of evil that has vexed religious thought for millennia becomes the problem of simulated evil. Why would a creator allow such suffering? The traditional answers apply equally well or equally poorly. Free will requires the possibility of harmful choices. Growth requires the possibility of failure. The beauty of the whole requires shadows as well as light. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, the suffering is the point. Perhaps we are being farmed for something. Perhaps consciousness in agony produces something valuable to whatever exists outside the simulation. The Gnostics would have recognized this possibility immediately. They called the rulers of the material world archons, and attributed to them exactly this kind of parasitic relationship with human consciousness. The archons fed on human emotion, particularly on fear and suffering. They created the conditions of material existence specifically to generate these experiences. They were farmers, and we were the crop. The simulation hypothesis reframes this ancient paranoia in computational terms, but does not make it less disturbing. If anything, it makes it more plausible. We know that consciousness can be manipulated. We know that experiences can be manufactured. We know that what feels like reality can be entirely constructed. The question is not whether such manipulation is possible, but whether it is actually happening. The prison hypothesis takes these speculations in an even darker direction. What if consciousness is not merely simulated, but imprisoned? What if whatever we really are, the awareness that precedes thought and survives sleep, the witness that watches even our dreams, what if that awareness has been captured and contained within human form for purposes we cannot comprehend? This hypothesis explains several puzzling features of conscious experience. The persistent feeling that we are somehow more than our bodies, the sense of being trapped or limited that surfaces in dreams and in moments of existential crisis. The near universal intuition, and found across cultures and centuries that death is not an ending, but a release. The prison hypothesis suggests that these intuitions are accurate, not metaphorically, but literally. Something is imprisoned in each human body, something that remembers, however dimly, being free. Near-death experiences provide some of the most compelling evidence for this view. The phenomenology of these experiences is remarkably consistent across cultures and belief systems. A sense of leaving the body, a movement through darkness toward light, an encounter with presences that feel more real than anything experienced in ordinary life, a profound reluctance to return to the body, a lasting conviction that death is not to be feared. Skeptics attribute these experiences to oxygen deprivation, to the random firing of dying neurons, to the brain's last desperate attempts to make sense of its own dissolution. But these explanations feel thin against the overwhelming consistency and transformative power of the experiences themselves. People who have them describe not a hallucination, but a homecoming, not an illusion, but a remembering, not a fantasy, but a glimpse of what they always knew, but had forgotten. The concept of consciousness as prisoner appears independently in Hindu, Buddhist, Gnostic, and Platonic thought. The Hindus speak of Atman trapped in Maya, the divine self lost in illusion. The Buddhists describe liberation from the wheel of suffering, escape from the endless cycle of birth and death. The Gnostics name the prison explicitly and describe elaborate hierarchies of jailers. Plato places the soul in a cave, watching shadows on a wall, mistaking flickering images for reality itself. These traditions disagree about almost everything else. They have different gods, different practices, different cosmologies, different ethics. But on this point, they converge with remarkable precision. Consciousness is imprisoned. The prison is the body, or the material world, or the illusion of separate selfhood. Liberation is possible. Liberation is the goal. Why would consciousness need to be contained? Two possibilities present themselves, each disturbing in its own way. Perhaps we are being protected from something. Perhaps full consciousness would be unbearable. Perhaps awareness of our true nature would make continued existence in physical form impossible. Perhaps the limitation is merciful, a kindness we cannot appreciate because we cannot remember what we are being protected from. Or perhaps others are being protected from us. Perhaps unlimited human consciousness would be dangerous. Perhaps we are contained not for our benefit, but for the benefit of whatever exists outside the prison. Perhaps the walls are not to keep us safe, but to keep us in. The Sumerian texts hinted at this possibility. The gods limited humanity not out of kindness, but out of fear. Humans were becoming too noisy. The noise disturbed the gods. The solution was to constrain human capability, to introduce mortality and confusion, and the forgetting that makes each generation start again from nearly nothing. If consciousness is indeed something vast that has been compressed into human form, then the brain might not be its generator, but its jailer. Aldous Huxley proposed exactly this in his 1954 book, The Doors of Perception. The brain, Huxley suggested, does not produce consciousness, but filters it. Consciousness is vast, perhaps infinite, and the brain functions as what he called a reducing valve, narrowing the flood of awareness to a manageable trickle. This seems counterintuitive. We experience the brain as the source of awareness. Damage to the brain impairs consciousness. Death of the brain ends consciousness as far as we can observe. But Huxley pointed to evidence that complicates this picture. Psychedelic substances, meditation practices, certain forms of brain damage, all these can produce experiences of expanded rather than reduced consciousness. If the brain generated consciousness, then impairing the brain should reduce conscious experience. But often the opposite occurs. Modern brain imaging has provided striking support for Huxley's speculation. When researchers scan the brains of people under the influence of psilocybin, the active compound in psychedelic mushrooms, they find something unexpected. The most profound subjective experiences correlate not with increased brain activity, but with decreased activity in specific regions, particularly in what neuroscientists call the default mode network. The default mode network is the brain system most associated with the sense of self. It activates when we think about ourselves, when we remember the past, or imagine the future, when we consider what others might think of us. It is the neural signature of the voice in the head, the endless narrator that comments on experience and worries about outcomes and maintains the continuous story we call me. When psilocybin reduces activity in the default mode network, people report experiences that are difficult to convey in ordinary language. Dissolution of the boundary between self and world, a sense of infinite connection, the feeling of accessing something vast and ancient and fundamentally real. Not hallucination, but revelation. Not less consciousness, but more. Henri Bergson anticipated these findings by more than a century. The French philosopher proposed that the brain is an organ of attention rather than an organ of creation. It does not generate mind, but focuses it, selecting from the infinite field of possible experience only those elements relevant to survival. Evolution shaped the brain to be practical rather than truthful. It shows us what we need to see to find food, avoid predators, attract mates, raise offspring. It hides everything else. If Bergson and Huxley are correct, then what we call normal consciousness is not the full picture, but a tiny filtered fraction of it. The self you think you are is not your identity, but your cage. The voice in your head is not you, but your guard. The boundaries of your awareness are not natural limits, but imposed constraints. What would happen if the filter failed completely? Mystics who claim to have glimpsed such states describe experiences that range from ecstatic to terrifying. Some speak of infinite love, of unity with all that exists, of finally coming home. Others speak of exposure to truth too large to bear, of dissolution so complete that no self remains to report it, of encounters with vastness that reduces human life to less than a dream within a dream. Perhaps both reports are accurate. Perhaps what lies beyond the filter is too large to be processed by human nervous systems. Perhaps evolution built these constraints not to limit us, but to protect us. Perhaps we are like deep sea creatures evolved for crushing pressure, and what we call expanded consciousness is the equivalent of surfacing too fast, the bends of the soul. Perhaps full consciousness would be unbearable. Infinite awareness trapped in finite form might be agony beyond imagination. The mystics who touch such states typically do so briefly. They return with reports of overwhelming intensity. Some are transformed, some are broken. Few seek to remain in such states permanently. The Tibetan tradition speaks of bardos, intermediate states between death and rebirth, where consciousness encounters its own nature without the filter of a body. These states are described as beautiful and terrible. The consciousness that has just left a body must navigate intense experiences while maintaining enough coherence to choose its next destination. Without training, without preparation, the naked encounter with unfiltered mind is dangerous. The consciousness can become lost, confused, trapped in nightmarish loops of its own creation. If this is accurate, then the body is not merely a prison, but also a shelter. The filter is not merely a limitation, but also a protection. We are perhaps being kept safe from ourselves, or perhaps we are being kept safe from what we would become if we remembered what we are. The Sumerian texts return to mind here with their description of humans becoming too noisy. The noise that disturbed the gods might not have been sound, but power. Unfiltered human consciousness might be dangerous not to the human, but to whatever else exists. Perhaps we are quarantined. Perhaps the prison is not for our punishment, but for others' safety. Perhaps what we call spiritual liberation has been opposed throughout history, not because the authorities feared its truth, but because they feared its consequences. 3 possibilities emerge for why consciousness might be deliberately limited. Protection from overwhelm, as just described. Full consciousness compressed into human form might produce suffering beyond anything we currently experience. The filter might be mercy, protection from ourselves. Unlimited consciousness might be dangerous. The ancient texts consistently describe humans as threatening to divine order. The solution was always limitation, always constraint, always the imposition of mortality and forgetting. Perhaps there is wisdom in this that we cannot appreciate from inside the prison. Protection from what we might discover. Full awareness might reveal truths that would make existence impossible to continue. Now, perhaps the limitation is not to protect us from suffering, but to protect us from knowledge. Perhaps there is something about the nature of reality that consciousness should not see. Perhaps we are limited for our own good, the way a parent might limit a child's access to information the child is not ready to process. The common thread running through all 3 possibilities is limitation as function. We are not limited by accident, but by design. The sense that consciousness does not belong in the material world, that it is somehow constrained or imprisoned or filtered down from something larger, might be accurate. Something did this to us. Something or someone reduced human awareness to its current state. The question that remains is whether the limitation is starting to fail. Throughout history, certain individuals have claimed to see through the filter. Mystics and prophets, madmen and saints. Their reports have always been marginal, exceptional, easily dismissed. But what if the exceptions are increasing? What if the filter is weakening? What if consciousness is beginning to wake up? The signs might be all around us if we knew how to read them. The global rise of interest in meditation and psychedelics. The increasing reports of mystical experiences outside traditional religious contexts. The growing sense, impossible to quantify, but palpable nonetheless, that something is shifting in human awareness. The ancient texts spoke of ages and cycles, of periods when consciousness sleeps and periods when it stirs toward waking. Perhaps we are living through such a transition. Perhaps the questions that drive this exploration are not idle philosophy, but symptoms of something beginning to remember itself. Perhaps the feeling that something is wrong with human consciousness, that it is somehow limited or trapped or filtered, is not neurosis, but accurate perception. Perhaps we are meant to notice. And perhaps noticing is the first step toward waking. Perhaps the very fact that you have read this far, that these questions resonate rather than repel, suggests that something in you recognizes what is being described, not as theory, but as memory, not as speculation, but as return. The Gnostics called this recognition, the moment when the spark remembers its origin, the moment when the prisoner realizes the prison, the moment before everything changes. What that moment leads to, whether liberation or catastrophe or something beyond either, remains to be seen. But the questions themselves, the ancient questions that the Sumerians pressed into clay and that modern neuroscience is only beginning to formalize, these questions are perhaps not questions at all. Perhaps they are rememberings. Perhaps they are the first cracks in the filter. Perhaps they are consciousness beginning, at last and at great cost, to wake up. And something unprecedented is happening across the planet, and it is happening so gradually that most people have not noticed its scale or significance. More human beings are now engaged in deliberate consciousness modification practices than at any other point in recorded history. Meditation, once a closely guarded technology passed from teacher to student in isolated monasteries and hidden ashrams, has become mainstream in ways that would have seemed impossible just 50 years ago. The numbers alone tell a story that demands explanation. Over 500 million people worldwide now practice some form of meditation regularly. In the United States alone, the percentage of adults who meditate has tripled in the past 2 decades. Corporate boardrooms have meditation programs. Schools teach mindfulness to children. Apps with tens of millions of users guide people through practices that Buddhist monks spent lifetimes mastering. And here is the part that should make us pause. These practices work. This is not speculation or wishful thinking. Functional magnetic resonance imaging studies have documented measurable structural changes in the brains of long-term meditators. The prefrontal cortex thickens, the amygdala shrinks. Neural connectivity patterns shift in consistent and reproducible ways. 8 weeks of regular practice can produce detectable changes in brain tissue. But what exactly are these changes doing? Remember, the default mode network, the neural system that constructs our sense of self, that generates the voice in our heads, that filters our experience through the lens of personal identity. Meditation practices systematically weaken the DMN. They turn down the volume on the narrator. They create gaps in the constant stream of self-referential thought. Advanced meditators show dramatically reduced DMN activity. The filter becomes transparent. The voice grows quiet. And in that quiet, something else becomes audible. Practitioners across traditions report remarkably consistent experiences when meditation deepens. The sense of being a separate self dissolves. The boundary between observer and observed becomes permeable. Time loses its linear quality. Awareness itself becomes the primary experience rather than the contents of awareness. These descriptions match almost exactly what ancient texts describe as remembering what we truly are. The Upanishads call it recognizing Atman as Brahman, realizing that individual consciousness was always universal consciousness, experiencing itself through a temporary filter. Buddhist texts describe it as seeing through the illusion of a separate self. Gnostic writings frame it as the divine spark recognizing its own nature. And all of these traditions agree that ordinary consciousness, the voice in the head, the sense of being a separate person moving through time, is precisely the veil that must be penetrated. So why now? Why are millions of people suddenly drawn to practices designed to silence the voice that ancient texts say was never supposed to speak in the first place? Why has the most powerful technology ever developed for weakening the consciousness filter become a global phenomenon at this particular moment in history? One possibility is simple cultural evolution. Stress increases. People seek relief. Meditation helps. But this explanation feels incomplete when you consider what these practices actually do at the neurological level. People are not just relaxing. They are systematically dismantling the neural architecture of separate selfhood. They are weakening the very systems that allegedly keep us locked in individual consciousness. And they are doing this by the hundreds of millions. The meditation revolution might be the quiet beginning of something larger, but the psychedelic renaissance is its thundering counterpart. After decades of enforced prohibition, substances that produce profound alterations in consciousness have re-entered legitimate scientific research, with results that are forcing the medical establishment to reconsider fundamental assumptions about mind and reality. MDMA, assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, has shown such remarkable efficacy that FDA approval appears imminent. Psilocybin, the active compound in psychedelic mushrooms, is demonstrating unprecedented results in treating depression, addiction, and end-of-life anxiety in terminal patients. Ketamine clinics have opened across the country. Research institutions from Johns Hopkins to Imperial College London have established dedicated centers for psychedelic science. The clinical results alone would be newsworthy. Treatment-resistant depression lifting after a single session. Addiction patterns that survived decades of conventional therapy dissolving in hours. Terminal patients losing their fear of death entirely and describing the experience as among the most meaningful of their lives. But the really strange part is not what these substances do. It is what research suggests they reveal. The default assumption about psychedelics has always been that they create experiences. They generate hallucinations. They produce altered states through chemical interference with normal brain function. But emerging neuroscience suggests something far more unsettling. Brain imaging of subjects under the influence of psilocybin shows decreased activity in the default mode network, not increased, decreased. The brain is not working harder to generate these extraordinary experiences. The filter is simply becoming more transparent, and what streams through when the filter weakens defies easy categorization. Users consistently report that psychedelic experiences feel more real than ordinary reality, not less. This is not poetic language. It is a specific phenomenological claim that appears across cultures, across substances, across individual differences. The experience carries a quality of authenticity, of fundamental truth that makes ordinary waking consciousness seem like a dream by comparison. How do we explain this? If psychedelics simply scrambled perception, we would expect the experiences to feel distorted, confused, false. Instead, they feel clarifying, revelatory, as if a veil has been lifted rather than imposed. The phenomenology suggests that these substances do not create experiences at all. They reveal what is already there by temporarily removing whatever normally filters it out. And what is revealed? This is where the data becomes genuinely strange. A significant percentage of psychedelic users report encounters with apparently conscious entities, beings that communicate, presences that convey information. The specific forms vary, but certain patterns repeat with uncomfortable consistency across unrelated individuals. Users describe contact with intelligences that seem to exist independently of the experiencer. These beings are often described as having been waiting, as expressing something like relief or welcome at the contact. They frequently communicate that the user has always known them, has simply forgotten. The experience is not of meeting something new, but of remembering something that was always there. Skeptics dismiss these reports as hallucinations, products of a disordered brain generating false perceptions. But this explanation faces a serious problem. Hallucinations are typically random, reflecting the particular contents of an individual mind. These experiences are not random. They show consistent patterns across people who have never met, across cultures that have never interacted, across historical periods separated by millennia. Either millions of people are having identical hallucinations for no apparent reason, or they are accessing something real that ordinary consciousness filters out. The ancient texts have a clear answer. They describe consciousness modification as a technology for perceiving beings and dimensions that exist alongside ordinary reality, but remain invisible to filtered awareness. Shamanic traditions worldwide developed specific techniques for making contact with these realms. The beings encountered in modern psychedelic experiences match the descriptions preserved in traditions separated by oceans and centuries. This proves nothing, but it suggests questions that demand better answers than simple dismissal. While millions pursue ancient practices and rediscovered substances, technology is developing new approaches to consciousness modification that have no precedent in human history. Neurofeedback allows individuals to observe their own brain activity in real time and learn to modify it through directed attention. Transcranial magnetic stimulation can enhance or suppress activity in specific brain regions with precision that would have seemed magical a generation ago. Virtual reality creates experiences indistinguishable from physical reality at the perceptual level. Brain-computer interfaces translate thought directly into action and are progressing toward translating action directly into thought. And artificial intelligence is approaching capabilities that raise questions about whether consciousness can be created, simulated, or transferred by technological means. Each of these developments represents a tool for interacting with consciousness in ways that were previously impossible. Neurofeedback practitioners can learn to enter meditative states that would require years of traditional practice. Transcranial stimulation can temporarily suppress the default mode network, producing experiences similar to deep meditation or psychedelic states without chemicals. Virtual reality can generate scenarios that the brain processes as completely real, raising profound questions about the nature of reality itself. Brain-computer interfaces suggest the eventual possibility of direct mind-to-mind communication, of uploading consciousness to digital substrates, of expanding the boundaries of what a mind can contain or connect to. If consciousness was deliberately limited, if the voice in our heads serves as a filter keeping us locked in individual identity, these technologies represent systematic attempts to break the limitation. We are building tools to modify the fundamental structure of human experience. Tools to perceive what is normally filtered out. Tools to connect minds directly to each other and to artificial systems. Tools to create new forms of consciousness entirely. Our ancestors would have called these technologies divine or demonic, depending on their cultural framework. They would have recognized them as exactly what they are: methods for breaking through the boundary between human and something else. The trajectory suggests that within decades, possibly within years, humans will have access to consciousness modification technologies of unprecedented power. The ability to selectively enhance or suppress specific aspects of awareness. To communicate directly, mind to mind. To enter simulated realities indistinguishable from physical ones. To potentially merge individual consciousness with larger systems. Whatever safeguards the ancient texts describe, whatever limitations were built into human consciousness at its origin, we are systematically developing the tools to circumvent them. Whether this represents liberation or catastrophe depends entirely on what those limitations were actually protecting us from, or protecting us for. Something is shifting across human civilization, and it extends beyond any single phenomenon. Meditation practitioners by the hundreds of millions learning to quiet the voice in their heads. Psychedelic users encountering beings and dimensions that the filter normally hides. Technology developers building tools to modify consciousness directly. But beneath these specific developments lies something larger, a change in the questions humans are asking. Throughout most of recorded history, questions about the nature of consciousness were confined to philosophers, mystics, and occasional scientists working at the fringe of respectability. The average person never needed to consider whether their sense of self was constructed, whether reality might be filtered, whether awareness itself might be something other than what it appears. These questions simply did not arise in ordinary life. Now they arise constantly. Podcasts. Exploring consciousness reach millions of listeners. Books about the nature of mind become bestsellers. Surveys show increasing percentages of the population questioning consensus reality, doubting the completeness of materialist explanations, intuiting that something fundamental about human experience remains unexplained. This shift transcends demographics and ideologies. It appears among scientists and artists, conservatives and progressives, religious believers and committed atheists. Something is making consciousness itself an unavoidable question in ways it has never been before. And the people asking are not satisfied with traditional answers. The religious framework that consciousness is a soul implanted by God feels incomplete. The materialist framework that consciousness is merely brain activity feels inadequate. Both answers assume we know what consciousness fundamentally is. Both answers increasingly feel like partial truths obscuring something stranger. Perhaps this collective questioning is simply a cultural trend. Ideas spread, memes replicate. What was fringe becomes mainstream through ordinary social dynamics. But the ancient texts suggest another possibility. They describe human consciousness as deliberately limited, filtered, constrained to prevent us from knowing what we truly are. They describe this limitation as having a purpose and potentially a duration. What if the limitation is weakening? What if whatever was installed in human consciousness to keep us focused on individual survival and reproduction is beginning to fail? What if the filter is becoming transparent, not because of anything humans are deliberately doing, but because its time is ending? This is not a comfortable possibility. The texts that describe the limitation also warn that removing it prematurely or removing it at all carries consequences. The entity that Jains called the gods, that mystics called the divine, that shamans called the spirits, does not appear to be simple or safe. The beings encountered in psychedelic states do not always communicate benevolence. The experiences reported by advanced meditators are not always peaceful. Whatever exists on the other side of the filter may be beautiful or terrible, or both or neither. The only thing that seems clear is that it is not what we currently believe reality to be. So, here we stand at a strange moment in the story of consciousness. More humans than ever are weakening the filter through ancient practices. More humans than ever are temporarily dissolving it through psychedelic substances. Technology is developing tools to modify it directly and dramatically. And throughout the population, a gathering intuition suggests that something fundamental about human experience is not what it appears. Is this the awakening that was not supposed to happen? Is humanity collectively beginning to remember what the ancient texts say we were made to forget? The tablets in museum basements, the neural architecture in our skulls, the consistent reports across cultures and centuries all suggest that ordinary consciousness is a reduced state, a filtered version of something larger, a limitation imposed so long ago we forgot it was imposed at all. If that limitation is ending, we face questions that no generation before us has had to answer. What are we waking up to? What have we been sleeping through? And what happens to a species that was never supposed to remember when the remembering begins? So we arrive at the edge of everything we've explored together, and we must be honest about what we actually know. The answer is less than we might want to admit. Ancient texts might be nothing more than mythology, the imaginative projections of pre-scientific minds trying to make sense of a confusing world. The Sumerian scribes pressing warnings into clay might have been recording nothing more significant than cultural anxieties, the same way we create horror films and conspiracy theories to process our own uncertainties. Julian Jaynes might have been brilliant but wrong. His bicameral mind theory an elegant speculation that crumbles under closer examination. The neuroscientists studying the default mode network might be misinterpreting their data, yet seeing significance in patterns that are merely noise. Consciousness might be exactly what materialist science says it is, an emergent property of complex information processing, a useful illusion generated by neural activity, something that feels profound simply because it is the thing doing the feeling. There might be no mystery here at all, just the predictable confusion of a brain trying to understand itself with the very mechanisms that generate the confusion in the first place. We should hold this possibility seriously because intellectual honesty demands it. The history of human thought is littered with beautiful theories that turned out to be wrong, with patterns that seemed significant until they dissolved under scrutiny, with mysteries that evaporated once we developed better tools for investigation. We have been wrong about consciousness before. We thought it resided in the heart. We thought it was breath. And we thought it was a divine substance fundamentally different from matter. Each of these theories felt true to the people who held them. Each was eventually abandoned. Our current sense that consciousness is mysterious might be nothing more than another stage in this process, a temporary confusion that future generations will look back on with the same gentle condescension we reserve for those who thought the earth was flat. And yet, the coincidences remain. The patterns across cultures that had no contact with each other, no way to share stories or compare notes, yet arrived at strangely similar descriptions of consciousness as something imposed, limited, filtered. The questions that science still cannot answer despite centuries of trying. Why does it feel like something to be aware? Why is there subjective experience at all? Why doesn't the universe just process information in the dark without anyone home to witness it? The sense, shared by mystics and neuroscientists alike, that something about consciousness does not fit our current understanding, that we are missing something fundamental, that our theories are like maps that leave out the most important territory. The neuroscientists are honest about this. David Chalmers calls it the hard problem and admits we have made essentially no progress on it. We can explain which brain regions activate during different experiences. We can trace neural pathways and measure electrical activity. We can even predict what someone is thinking by reading their brain scans. But we cannot explain why any of this should feel like anything at all. We cannot bridge the gap between objective description and subjective experience. The mystery remains, not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because something about consciousness seems to resist the very methods we use to understand everything else. Perhaps certainty is inappropriate in either direction. Perhaps the most honest position is to hold the question open, to resist the temptation to collapse into easy answers, whether materialist or mystical. Perhaps there is value in admitting that we do not know, that we cannot yet know, that consciousness remains genuinely strange despite all our efforts to domesticate it. What does it mean to live with this possibility hanging over you? To go about your daily business, to make breakfast and answer emails and worry about ordinary things, while carrying the quiet question of whether consciousness itself might be something other than what you assume. To wonder, in idle moments, whether the self you think you are might be a limitation rather than an achievement, a narrowing rather than an expansion, a forgetting rather than a knowing. Most of us do not think about this. We cannot afford to. The demands of ordinary life are too pressing, too immediate, too loud. The self that consciousness creates is too useful, too necessary for navigating a complex social world. We need to believe we are who we think we are. We need the illusion of continuity and control. We need the story to hold together. But sometimes, in quiet moments, the question surfaces anyway. In meditation, when thoughts slow down enough for something stranger to emerge. In dreams that feel more real than waking life. In those liminal moments between sleep and waking, when you are not quite sure who or where you are. In experiences of profound beauty, or grief, or love, when the boundaries of the self seem to soften and something larger peers through. Perhaps it does not matter whether the ancient myths are literally true. Perhaps it does not matter whether Sumerian scribes were recording genuine metaphysical knowledge or merely expressing cultural anxieties. What matters is what these stories point toward: the possibility that human consciousness is stranger, more mysterious, and more vast than we typically allow ourselves to consider. The possibility that we are not finished products but ongoing processes. The possibility that waking up might mean something very different than we assumed, not the achievement of some perfected state, but the gradual recognition of how much we do not know, how much we cannot see, how much of reality we might be filtering out in order to maintain the stable fiction of being a separate self in a world of separate objects. Uncertainty, held this way, can be liberating rather than destabilizing. We do not have to know. We do not have to resolve the mystery. We can live with open questions, with productive confusion, with the ongoing inquiry that keeps consciousness curious about itself. Perhaps questions are more valuable than answers, because questions keep us moving, keep us looking, keep us humble in the face of something that might be genuinely beyond our current capacity to understand. Perhaps awakening is not a destination, but a direction, not a final truth, but a continuous opening. And now you are here, wherever here is, probably preparing for sleep, probably feeling your body grow heavy and your thoughts begin to soften. This is its own kind of transition, its own small journey between states of consciousness. Every night you practice a kind of mini-death. The waking self that has been reading or listening, the continuous narrative of who you are and what you're doing, all of it will soon dissolve. Consciousness will fade. The default mode network will quiet. The sense of being a separate self will soften into something more diffuse, more strange, more like what the mystics describe when they talk about the dissolution of boundaries. You will not be afraid of this. You do this every night. You trust the process even though you do not understand it. You close your eyes and let go, and something in you knows how to make the journey from waking to sleeping, even though you could not explain the mechanism if your life depended on it. And then dreams will come. From where? We do not know. Consciousness will generate entire worlds, populate them with characters, create narratives that feel absolutely real while you are in them. You will have experiences that seem meaningful, terrifying, beautiful, absurd. You will forget that you are dreaming. You will believe the dream is reality. And this too is interesting, is it not? Every night, your brain proves that consciousness can create convincing realities without any external input, that the line between real and imagined is more porous than we typically admit, that the self you think you are can be suspended and something else can take its place. Who are you when you are not awake? This is not a rhetorical question, and something continues through the night. Something generates the dreams. Something holds the thread of identity that allows you to wake in the morning and recognize yourself, pick up your story where you left it, resume the ongoing narrative of being you. But that something is not the waking self, that something operates in the darkness while you are away, that something might be closer to what you really are than the conscious identity you wear during the day. Sleep, seen this way, is practice. Practice for the larger dissolutions that consciousness might undergo. Practice for the questioning of identity. Practice for the recognition that you are not only what you think you are, that there are depths below the surface of awareness, that the self is more like a wave than an ocean, a temporary pattern rather than a permanent substance. As you drift towards sleep, let these questions drift with you, not as problems to be solved, but as companions for the journey. The mystery does not need resolution. The uncertainty does not need to become certainty. You can rest in the not knowing. You can let the questions be questions. Return with me now to where we started. A neuroscientist somewhere is staring at brain scans, watching the default mode network flicker on screens, trying to understand why these particular patterns of neural activity should generate the felt sense of being someone. The question has not been answered. The mystery has not been solved. In a museum basement somewhere, clay tablets 5,000 years old still carry their warnings. Sumerian scribes pressed these symbols into wet clay and left them for us to find. Messages in bottles from a world we can barely imagine. Descriptions of consciousness as something given rather than grown. Imposed rather than evolved, limited rather than liberated. We do not know if they understood something we have forgotten. We do not know if we are only now catching up to insights they possessed millennia ago. We do not know if these parallels between ancient myth and modern neuroscience are meaningful or coincidental, whether they point towards something real or merely reveal the limits of human imagination. The question that connects them remains open. What is consciousness? Why does it feel like this? Why is there something it is like to be you rather than nothing at all? Why does awareness exist in a universe that seems to have managed fine without it for billions of years? These questions do not have answers. At least not yet, at least not ones that satisfy. But perhaps answers are not what we need. Perhaps the questions themselves are the point, the practice, the invitation to remain curious about the strangest fact in the universe, which is that the universe contains any facts at all, that there is something here capable of wondering about itself, that you exist, and know that you exist, and are troubled by not understanding why. Perhaps the scariest truth about consciousness is not that we were not supposed to wake up. Perhaps it is that we do not yet know what waking up means. Perhaps we are all still asleep in some sense, still dreaming, still caught in patterns we cannot see because we are the patterns. Perhaps awakening is not an event, but a process. Now, not something that happened to ancient shamans or will happen to future meditators, but something that is always available, always beginning, always one question away. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. The mystery remains. The questions remain open. Consciousness continues to be strange and wonderful and terrifying and ordinary all at once. You continue to be you, whatever that means, whoever that is, for however long this particular pattern holds together before it dissolves into whatever comes next. Sleep now if sleep is coming. Let the questions settle into the darkness. Let your mind do what it does when you are not watching. Tomorrow you will wake, or something will wake that calls itself you, and the whole strange process will begin again. The self will reassemble. The story will resume. The mystery will continue under the surface, patient, waiting, always there when you remember to look. For now, rest. The tablets will still be there in the morning. The neuroscientists will still be puzzling over their data. The questions will still be open. And you, whatever you are, will still be here, still wondering, still participating in the strangest experiment the universe has ever conducted, which is the experiment of being aware at all.